Former Nebraska Congressman Jeff Fortenberry is expected to go to trial again in February, this time in federal court in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, a California jury found him guilty of lying to the FBI. An appeals court overturned that conviction because of where the trial was held. The appeals court ruled the case should have been tried where the alleged crimes happened, which was in Nebraska or Washington, D.C., not in California. Earlier this year, Fortenberry was indicted in D.C. He faces the same allegations that he twice lied about campaign cash illegally funneled from a Nigerian billionaire.